On behalf of Indigenous Engagement and Communications at the University of Manitoba and the Centre for Human Rights Research, I'd like to welcome you all to an event in honor of the Provincial Day of Awareness and Education and the National Day of Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Plus. My name is Kayla LaRiviere, and I'm the Engagement Lead with Indigenous Engagement and Communications here at the University. I'd like to take this time to acknowledge the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the national homeland of the Métis Nation. I recognize Treaty 3 territory, Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, the source of Winnipeg's clean drinking water. In addition, the treaty territories that have been left with a multitude of devastating impacts in order to provide us with access to electricity we use in both our personal and professional lives. The University of Manitoba respects the treaties that were made on these territories, acknowledges the harms and mistakes of the past, and dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Today, we come together to recognize the thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit Plus people in Canada by encouraging learning and building awareness to end violence against MMIW2S. We will begin this morning with a seminar by Dr. Karine Duhamel, followed by a laughing yoga workshop with Don Chartrand, as I believe laughter is a form of medicine. You're welcome to join us over the lunch hour, as we invite you to keep the conversation going by chatting with your fellow guests. A few housekeeping notes: there are washrooms located outside the room to your left for female and gender accessible, and males on the right. We also have access to this outdoor space now, so you're welcome to take a minute and step out if you need. We just ask that no smoking on the patio, please. So I will now begin by introducing our guest speaker. So Dr. Karine Duhamel is an Anishinaabe-Métis and a member of Red Rock First Nation. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from Mount Allison University, a Bachelor of Education from Lakehead University, and a master's degree and PhD in history from the University of Manitoba. From 2018 to 2019, she was the Director of Research for the historic National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, drafting the final report, directing the Legacy Archive, and managing the Forensic Document Review Project. She is now Director of Indigenous Strategy from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, working to implement and strategize plan focused on supporting Indigenous researchers and research and researchers. Dr. Duhamel is also a Dialogue Fellow at the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University and an affiliate of the Centre for Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. Welcome, Karine.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation, and thank you for the very kind introduction. It's always a bit bizarre to hear yourself introduced and kind of think about like, oh yeah, I did participate in that. It's really my honor and my pleasure this morning to come and speak with you, not only about the National Inquiry, but a bit of a reflection on where we're at. Next year will be 5 years since we released the final report, and I think that consensus among us who worked on it and are still working on it is pretty clear that not enough has been done, and we need to kind of get to work in a way that honors what family members and survivors told us about their experiences and about what they know. And so my presentation today will focus not so much on the inquiry, though I'll provide a little bit of context, but also just on kind of a reflection on where we're at and thinking about what we need to move forward. I think that we've seen this week with some big changes here in Manitoba, and that's changed a little bit what I was going to say. So in a good way, I think. But anyways, I think there's lots to be hopeful for. But I think that this is one of those things that we can't stop pushing for this work, and we can't stop pushing for this change, because every day that we wait is another day that another mother, sister, friend, auntie, grandma is no longer with us. And so that's really the importance of this work. Pardon me, it was the importance of this work almost 5 years ago, and it's still the importance of this work now. So thank you for the introduction. I am a member of Red Rock Indian Band, and I come from there via all of my kind of female ancestors, starting with a lady named Marie Wenegosh, who married a self-styled, self-declared count who came over from France. And so my history is very much kind of entwined in the history of the fur trade. And really, my ancestors, who are the Delerons, can be found in myriad of places throughout northwestern Ontario and also here. I was raised most of my life here in Winnipeg, but I did leave for a while to do some schooling and spend a year near the community in Thunder Bay when I went to go do my Bachelor of Education. So for me, this has been a process really of reconnecting. My mom's from Thunder Bay. Anybody that knows Thunder Bay knows that Thunder Bay is not a very nice place to be an Indigenous person. Particularly for some of my other relatives who have been there for a long time and who live adjacent to or in the community. And so it was sort of a heart move for me, but something that I thought was really important too, because I was mostly raised here. So, it's really customary to kind of introduce yourself and where you're from, but also I want to share that some of the information that I'm going to be sharing to you today comes from a lot of the elders that I had a chance to work with during the National Inquiry, in particular, members of the Grandmothers Circle. So during the National Inquiry, we had two kind of advisory circles that traveled with us. It wasn't just that they provided advice. They were like our family, like they traveled with us. They came to all the events. One of those circles was the Grandmothers and Elders Circle. Every commissioner during the inquiry had a grandmother or an elder that they traveled with. And a lot of those elders and grandmothers came to be really close with some of us on staff as well, because we were going around the country with them. In particular, elders Kathy Lewis, Laureen Blue Waters, Bernie Williams, all of whom have contributed very much to my perspective and my learning on this issue, have really been instrumental, and they continue to do the work, and they continue to be out there. So my presentation, today, if I can, there we go. I just learned about the slideshow button this morning. I was this years old when I learned about this. It's called She is Sacred, Reflections on the National Inquiry. And for those of you that aren't as familiar, just a really quick sort of primer. So the National Inquiry was really driven by family members and survivors. We talk about it being kind of announced by government at a certain point, but it was really family members and survivors, many of whom had been working, not just for months and not just for a couple of years, but decades, who really pushed the government to launch this inquiry. As you all know, of course, it was also one of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And in 2016, the National Inquiry was announced and really got going in 2017. The mandate of the National Inquiry is the broadest and most expansive mandate ever given to an inquiry in Canada in relatively the shortest amount of time ever given to an inquiry in Canada. Our mandate, for those of you that don't know it, was to report on the systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including sexual violence. We were also asked to examine the underlying social, economic, cultural, institutional, and historical causes that contribute to historical and ongoing violence, and then also to look into and to report on existing institutional policies and practices to address violence. So this is a very big bucket, right? And it's big not only because the topics are so kind of interwoven and cross-disciplinary, but also big in the sense that there was no start or end date. There was no geographical kind of scope or limitation placed on us. And so it was both a tremendous challenge. Like when I was not working there and I read about it, it was a tremendous challenge, but I felt really genuinely also an opportunity to look at this issue in a way that inquiries and commissions don't typically get to look at it, because often they're very much circumscribed by the terms imposed on them. So the idea that this mandate was so broad and so expansive really allowed us as a research team and as a legal team, who are my counterparts in this, to look at this issue in the way that people told it to us. Often when we think about kind of inquiries and evidence, they are a way in which the state typically kind of archives itself, right? It's the way that you put on the official record what's happening. And so sometimes there's a danger in that, because the way that the state organizes the inquiry or the commission can be quite strategically kind of designed to reflect better on itself than it normally would. But this kind of scope of mandate, the opportunity we were given to really sit down with people, regardless of how they had been impacted by the issue, when they were impacted by this crisis, all of these things really opened up kind of our ability to do this. One of the things that was really striking to me was then, and it still is now, is how the language of crisis is often used to kind of diminish the scope and the scale of this issue of violence. Often, when we think of crisis, we think of it as sort of a limited moment, kind of a flashpoint, right? And what I'm really interested in this now is the way in which governments continue to use this language of crisis to either ignore or limit what they're willing to do with reference to this issue. And if you place a crisis at a certain point in time, you naturally limit the solutions that you're willing to apply to the crisis. So the truth-gathering process that the National Inquiry ran was made up of 3 parts, and it's just important for you to understand the parts because I'm going to dive into some of those parts later. The first part was really focused on family members and survivors. We really wanted to start by hearing from the real experts, people that we considered to have the best knowledge, the best expertise, the most to say about this. And so through part 1, people could testify in a variety of ways. They could come to a community hearing. We had 14 of those across the country. They could also submit a statement, so we would send a statement gatherer to their home or to their community or wherever they felt safe or comfortable to gather the information, and it would be entered into evidence. They could also testify in camera, so in private with commissioners, without the cameras and without the broadcasting and without anybody else other than legal counsel and the commissioners and their health supports. And then they could also testify in a really interesting way, which is the first time that's ever happened in an inquiry or commission, which is via the Legacy Archive. So the Legacy Archive is a collection of artistic expressions created by families and members and survivors, and people could either create an artistic expression independent of any testimony, so they didn't have to testify to create an artistic expression, or they could do so in conjunction with any other form of testimony. So this really afforded the opportunity to think about this issue in a different way. And the pieces from the Legacy Archive, there are over 800 of them, and they're like beadwork and sketches and drawings and poems and sculptures, like almost everything, are really kind of the inspiration and helped recenter us in this concept of the sacred, and she is sacred, because the way that people chose to create their artwork didn't focus on the moment that person was taken or all of the things that had happened to them or the way that they'd been targeted. Almost all of the expressions actually focused on what made that person special or what was missing now that they were gone. So it was a pretty dramatically different kind of way to think about and to look at this issue, but also at the solutions. Parts 2 and 3 of the truth-gathering process focused on experts and knowledge keepers, elders, and other kind of academics. So we had a series of focused hearings on key issues like trafficking, like mining, like all these different kind of resource exploitation, all these different sorts of issues that allowed us to invite people with a particular area of expertise and to really focus on some of those big issues. What we heard from people, regardless of where they came from, whether they were First Nations, Métis, Inuk, if they were status, if they were old or young, if they were women, if they identified as women or as Two-Spirit people, all of the things that we heard, no matter where somebody came from, were really remarkably similar. And so even though we heard from almost 3,000 people over the whole process, there were some real core elements to all of those stories that are really the basis for the calls for justice and the basis for the work that needs to happen next. for many people, the experience of violence that they came to tell us about, in fact, for all people, the experience of violence that they came to tell us about specific to why they came was really a much longer story. It was a story of generations. It was a story of colonization. It was a very old story that was new again in every single generation and in every articulation of violence. And so even though we had this huge body of evidence to draw on, the words and the artwork and the kind of expressions of all of these people affected by this issue, what was really striking is that every single story had the same sort of core features which turned into the root causes that we identified that sustain violence. As I mentioned, one of the really interesting things that we wanted to do is really to take a strengths-based approach. I'm a historian by training, and we don't talk a lot about that in historical methodologies, really, but it is something that's a lot more prevalent and common in other disciplines. And working with the research team and being inspired by their work in other places and in other kinds of academic disciplines, it was really neat to kind of think about how we could approach this from a strengths-based perspective and in less sort of technical or legalistic sort of terms. How could we look at this report as an opportunity to raise up and hold space for the voices of family members and survivors? And how could we think about how to integrate strength-based perspectives from Indigenous worldviews into the work that we were doing. One of the elders who came and testified out on the East Coast talked about how, this manifestation of the beauty of culture, everything that our ancestors took, they turned into such beauty, such art, and they used every tool they ever had access to write, to tell us stories, to record history. So from carvings to paint on rocks to tools of beadwork and the way we dress, all that was all of stories about our identity, our history, and who we are as a people. That was most clear in all of the things that people said, but also in all of the things that they made, and in this core belief that we operated under as a national inquiry around this idea that our women, girls, and to us LGBTQI plus people are sacred. Some of you may be familiar with the viral photo campaign that we created as a way to build awareness, but there were other ways that we tried to promote this too. For example, in addition to the final report, there is an education guide, a student and youth engagement guide, it's no longer called the education guide, called Their Voices Will Guide Us, and it's based on examples and ways that teachers can integrate this topic into their classroom in grade appropriate sort of ways. So that was a big thing. And then the other one, of course, is the Legacy Archive. So the Legacy Archive was a really interesting project because it was one of those things that every time you talk to somebody about it, including folks in museums and in education, they thought, oh, what a wonderful idea. Like, we love this idea, right? But when it came to the end of the inquiry and our attempts to find a home for the Legacy Archive so that it wouldn't end up in some dusty basement at Library and Archives Canada, no one wanted to touch it. It was really challenging as a collection because, I think that people felt like some level of anxiety in terms of being able to care for it, given that it contained the expressions of so many family members and so many people directly impacted by this issue. But some of the stories that the Legacy Archives tells, I think, are really valuable and are worth sharing. So, this is a piece that was created by DJ Monica Rumbold. It's called Motherly Love. DJ also testified in person. And mothers featured really heavily in a lot of the artistic expressions, this idea of mothers. Motherly Love was donated by this artist from Port Hope, Simpson, Newfoundland. And she donated it in Happy Valley Goose Bay. Monica talked in her testimony about how hard her mother worked as a provider and a protector of their family. She talked about her mother's compassion and her love, her compassion for others as well, and her dedication. And she talked about her strength and how that really inspired her to, continue to do this kind of work and become the person she is today. What was really, this piece was so striking to us that we put it on the cover of the final report because we loved it so much. But it was like a lot of the other expressions as well that talked about mothers really spoke to this idea of intergenerational strength rather than intergenerational trauma. And we thought that that was a really important and valuable sort of insight. Another piece that we saw were these beaded booties. Beaded booties were created by Lorraine Richard, who is Métis, and it was created in memory of all of the children who have been impacted by this issue, children who have been left without mothers or aunties as a result of those folks being targeted by violence. A lot of expressions also spoke to children and babies. So we had quite a few pairs of booties that people made and that they donated to the Legacy Archive as a way not only of talking about the impact on children and youth, but also of kind of identifying, the generations that are lost when one person is taken. And so for me, that was a really kind of striking piece. This piece is kind of from around here. It's a piece of Red River driftwood that was collected and sent in memory of all the women whose remains have been left in or near the Red River. For the person that collected it, she really felt like the piece kind of held their spirits in some way. And so this was a piece from the collection that required some extra care in terms of making sure that, we're just following the artist's kind of, or the donator's protocols and wishes for the piece, but also making sure that it continues to carry those spirits. A lot of people also brought in some traditional teachings or ceremonies or knowledge into this space. And so this Bear Clan mural was created by a couple of sisters from Anishinaabe-Métis, Quebec, so Veronique and Bridget Andre. And they donated this bear mural, which was created in memory of the sisters' parents. They talked about how important the bear is in their community in many ceremonies, and how the spirit of the bear in their community represents kind of a symbol of strength. They also talked about how in their community they use bear oil for medicinal purposes. And so this had like multiple layers of meaning in terms of generating conversations about the importance of culture and of ceremony within the work that we're doing. They offered the mural really as a way for families to start their healing journey and also to bring the families courage as they were coming forward and sharing their stories with us. They also offered the mural in memory of their aunt who had gone missing several years prior. Some of the expressions were also very specific to different people. It's hard, and I always make sure that I think about the individuals, because when we talk about MMIWG, it's very, very easy to start thinking about it at a macro level, right? Like the statistics and the kind of the aggregate of this violence. But really important to remember, and one of the things that I was really touched by are the individual stories that people brought forward and some of the people that they talked about, right? We heard about an Inuk woman named Deidre, whose daughter came to talk about her, and who talked about how her mother was also welcoming and ready to help people, and how, she would always have like a pot of tea on the table, and if you needed something, you could go and see her. And her laugh was so big that it would fill a whole room, right? Or somebody named Michelle, whose brother came to talk about how after his mother was targeted for violence, his sister Michelle took care of him, and she always made sure that his birthday was really special, and then he had she would put notes in his lunchbox to tell him to have a great day, right? So some of these very individual stories were really important also in thinking about this work, thinking about this concept of the sacred. This is a piece that was created by someone named Brandon Poitras, and he created this sculpture, and like not a professional artist, this is an amateur artist who came and shared his testimony about his sister, but who wanted to create this piece because his sister loved roses. So it was some of these pieces are not just about kind of the macro, but they're about the stories. And I think that when we think about MMIWG, well, it's important to think about it kind of big picture. It's equally important and valuable to think about these stories and to think about these individuals. Also in the Legacy Archive, one of the things that was interesting is there was a lot of kind of allies that created artistic expressions who had actually just heard about the issue in the news or who had watched some of the hearings on TV and who wanted to kind of make an expression of solidarity with the family members. So this gentleman, Chris Scott, wrote a song called Highway of Tears, which was inspired both by what was going on in his area, because he lives near Highway 16, also known as the Highway of Tears. Anyways, he's non-Indigenous, and he performed it in his home and sent us the video, and wanted to kind of share the song with family members to give those that are left behind some hope, and would really with the hopes that it would connect to their experiences and to the public and just show some solidarity. Some of the expressions, too, were really important kind of expressions of distinctions-based considerations. Again, when you often think about or talk about MMIWG, we often don't think about it or talk about it in a distinctions-based way. And I think that's a real miss, and we'll talk a little bit more about data in a bit. But really, some of the artistic expressions really made it clear that there was also some really important kind of cultural and distinctions-based considerations on this issue. Sister Drummer was a poem and this beautiful sketch created by Jason Sikwak, an Inuk man from Rigalet, Nunatsiavut. I always screw up that word, so I'm glad that I got it today. He created this sketch along with a poem, and the watercolor is really about, the story of the watercolor is an Inuk woman drumming, and it was created in memory of his loved one, whose name was Elaine Flowers. And the poem that accompanies this piece really reflects the heavy emotion that someone carries with the loss of a loved one. It talks about kind of how her amauti is empty, so the amauti being the coat, right? Her amauti is empty. She carries no child. Her burden is heavier than any. She carries with her the names of the missing, of the murdered, of the lost mothers, sisters, and daughters. So, again, a lot of these pieces are really interesting, I think, and different kinds of evidence. Evidence that you wouldn't normally incorporate or consider in any inquiry or commission that I'm aware of, and also speak to some of these strengths-based solutions, right? Culturally based solutions, ceremonially based insights, all of these different kinds of ways that people know in community what needs to happen, and that governments continue to ignore. I want to share two more things. This one was a really neat project, and it's interesting for educators in particular. This was a quilt that was donated by second-year students in social work at MacEwan University. We know that social work as a field really, I think disproportionately targets is like not a strong enough word, but I'm going to use it because I don't know what else to call it, but disproportionately targets Indigenous families. And this was a project that they did within the program to honor the memory of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. So to make the quilt, each student wrote a letter to someone who has been lost, telling her how she was was and is loved. The quilt was smudged by elders once it was assembled so that the letters would pass into the spirit world and rejoin the people to whom they were intended or to whom they were written. For students, the hope of this quilt was also to let family members know that they were not alone. And so for me, this is a really powerful expression too of the importance of allies in all of this work and the importance of education in all of this work. Finally, and as the cover of my presentation speaks to, this community art piece, which was an installation that was made at a statement gathering event. So families came to the Soust Center in Vancouver and gave their statements. But as they were leaving, the artist facilitating this piece, Jessica Slater, provided each of them with a tile that they could decorate in memory of their loved one or in memory of their family members. And so it's hard to see from far away, but once you really get into each of the individual tiles, again, they speak very strongly to the importance of kind of looking at this through the lens of Indigenous worldviews, through stories, through songs, through ceremonies, and thinking about what that means, how that changes our approach to addressing the issues. In the end, everything that we heard, came to these 4 root causes. So the first root cause that we talked about was unresolved multi-generational and intergenerational trauma. Every single story that we heard was about that, in some way, whether it was relocation, whether it was Indian residential schools, whether it was, over-criminalization and incarceration, whether it was economic dispossession, removal from land. Every single story had an intergenerational component, but also a multi-generational component in that multiple living members of the same family were still impacted by all of these things. In addition, we identified economic and social marginalization as a current that ran through every single testimony. No one we talked to, wanted to live in an unsafe neighborhood or, wanted to hitchhike to school or to work. Not one person that we talked to wanted to be in the position that they or their loved ones found themselves in. But this process, and I use marginalization in a very active way. And I don't think marginalization happens to people. I think marginalization is done to people. And so for that reason, I want you to kind of regard this one in a very active kind of sense. The third root cause that we talked about was lack of political will in maintaining the status quo. Because I was the only historian on my team, I decided to do a bit of a historical inquiry into the extent to which this issue or related issues have been documented and ignored. And so, the reality is that when you go into the archives, when you go into the records, it's very clear that, there's been knowledge of this. There's been, pretty deep knowledge actually about what some of these root causes are and how they work, and a failure to act on them. And then finally, the denial of the agency and expertise of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. One of the interesting things we heard about and we integrated into the report was all these really interesting and powerful programs that were being designed and led and run in community that were actually making a significant difference in terms of prevention. And one of the things about prevention that's really difficult is that in government, what gets measured gets done, and if you can't measure it, it's very hard to get it done. Prevention is one of those things that's really difficult to measure because you can't accurately measure how your intervention will necessarily prevent anything from happening, and so it's really hard to kind of push that forward when you want to kind of focus on prevention. So all these programs that were funded for like a year or 2 years, and then people couldn't do them anymore because there was no more support for them, were a really important way in which we've continued to let down family members and continued to let down survivors in all of these other areas like healing, like employment and training and education, and like kind of all of the things that come together to target people. It was really important to family members that we talked about violence in a specific way. They didn't want us to talk about people being vulnerable. They didn't want us to talk about that at all. They wanted us to talk about people being targeted. And I think that is one of the things that we were able to really preserve in the final report, to make sure that, it's clear that this is actually a genocide. People are targeted. It's not accidental that this exists. It's not accidental that these rates of violence continue to manifest themselves throughout generations and in all these different contexts. None of this is accidental. There's a design here, and it's a design that operates at a structural level, at a systemic level, kind of at a people level, at an institutional level, but as an aggregate, it is genocide. Right? So ultimately, we came up with a report, and again, on the strengths-based piece of it, it is called Reclaiming Power in Place. It is not called, an account of all the terrible things that have happened. It is not called, an account of terrible violence and genocide. It is called Reclaiming Power in Place, and it's called Reclaiming Power in Place because that's how we saw the solutions, and that's still how I see the solutions. So, reflecting on the past almost 5 years, I can say that, having worked in different kind of roles and having different perspectives on this, not just within the National Inquiry, but also working on the National Action Plan as chair of the Data Sub-Working Group, that there is a lot, there's almost nothing that's been done substantively. In Budget 2021, the Government of Canada came out with massive investments in MMIWG, but they hadn't fundamentally changed the lens through which they see them. So in a lot of cases, these were top-ups on existing programs that we know have not necessarily worked, right? It's a Band-Aid on an existing Band-Aid, and it's not sustainable, and it's not terribly effective. And that's why, for me, one of the things, there are two things I think that we need to really focus on going forward. So first of all, there's this issue of data. Nobody likes to talk about data, but as I've learned over the last 3 years or so, kind of being in proximity to these different things, and I'm not like a data geek myself, I've become one, but I didn't start out that way, is that, it is true. In government, if it's not measured, it's not done, right? It's one of the reasons that there's very few programs very few programs or very little investment specifically in Two-Spirit people or transgender people or programs or policies. It's one of the reasons for which all of these kind of solutions that tend to be generated are generated in non-place specific ways or in non-distinctions-based ways. And so there are programs and they're for wherever and whoever, but they're not necessarily targeted towards regions that are, where the rate of violence is much higher or, tied to, like resource exploitation sites where we know and, we could document this. So there's an awful lot of information that governments do not collect, that as a society we don't collect, no one collects. But the lack of having that information translates into a lack of investment and a lack of services, right? And this is one of the very difficult and long-term obstacles to progress from my perspective on this file. If we don't change what we're measuring, and if we don't start to create indicators or data that speak to the importance and the value of investment in prevention, then I think we really miss the mark, because we're going to continue to take a reactive policy position on this file rather than being proactive about what needs to be done and supporting people to do the work that needs to be done. So data is not a fun topic, but it's super important when we think about kind of where we're at and where we're going. The other thing that I think is really, really important is that we haven't fundamentally changed this idea that kind of lives in society, that often lives in government, around people being the cause of this, like people being responsible for this, so victim blaming, right? Some of you may know about something, it's called Project CARE, and it's deceptively named because it's not very nice. It is a project that was started by the RCMP in Alberta a number of years ago that aimed, I guess the objective of it was to create a database in case people went missing or were murdered. But what they did is they asked Indigenous women who were involved in sex work to pre-submit DNA and fingerprints in case they were ever, had gone missing. It was an egregious kind of bizarre project that resulted actually in a significantly large database of personal information, but that was specifically targeted at people who the RCMP deemed to be at risk, right? And at risk, seeing someone as at risk is very different from seeing them as targeted, and it leads to very different solutions. So again, in terms of reflecting on where we're at, one of the things that I think it has slowed down or halted progress on the implementation of the calls for justice is this continuing kind of denial of this, like, I don't know, like this big elephant in the room, like a epistemological elephant that says that Indigenous women are responsible for this violence, right? And communities are responsible for this violence. One of the interesting things, and it kind of links the data part and this together, that we did in the context of the forensic document review is we interviewed Brenda Lucky, who was at the time the commissioner of the RCMP, and we interviewed several members of the RCMP about the creation of their very now famous report, the operational review of 2014, I think, or 2015, which said that over 70% of homicides are actually committed by Indigenous men. And we asked about the stat, and it turns out that what happened was they had based that statistic on the on 32 cases, 32. It's not a good statistic. The sample is 32 cases over a very limited time period, and only on solved cases. The cases that are easiest to solve are the cases where the violence is perpetrated by someone that you know, right? And so the solve rate was used essentially there, over 70%, for them to kind of mount this, or to publish this report that said that over 70% of homicides are committed by Indigenous men, not accounting for all the other statistics that are in there. So, there was 231 calls for justice. If you asked me, like, how many have been completed? I don't actually know for sure, but I think like none, right? I think there's various pieces kind of in different stages of progress, that are happening. But really, we haven't made progress. And I think it's egregious given not only the very rich kind of body of evidence that we've presented, but also the way in which the report tied very explicitly to Canada's human rights obligations, both internationally and domestically. We are not asking for governments to do things that they haven't agreed to necessarily. We are asking them to honor commitments that they have already made in a way that's meaningful for Indigenous people and for Indigenous families. And so I've been working on a project lately, and it's called There's No Word in My Language for Reconciliation. I've been doing this project with another scholar from the University of Regina, who is also a really cool person, just generally, overall a nice cat. Her name is Dr. Emily Grafton, and she's Métis, and she's a professor at the University of Regina. And Emily and I had been having a conversation at one point around how, reconciliation's kind of like taken on a bad vibe since, common usage of the term first emerged. It's become, I think for a lot of folks that we've talked to, really devoid of meaning and, really kind of performative. And so we wanted to start to do this project that's really based on Indigenous languages and speaking with Indigenous language keepers and Indigenous language learners about what reconciliation means in their language. It's really interesting because what you find, and again, this is like a project that we haven't been, we've been at it, I think, for about a year, but we've created an article with what we've got so far, which is going to be published, yay, very soon. It's been accepted, yay, with minor revisions. But anyways, the project really focuses on sitting down with language keepers and language learners and asking them, what is the word in your language for reconciliation? So we talked to a Michif language learner. I also talked to a fluent Michif speaker apart from this. We talked to someone who is a learning Anishinaabe-Moan, and then someone who has a kind of an interesting background, but speaks, a lot of different languages, who is a grandmother in the Medeawin Lodge, and has a lot of kind of traditional knowledge and is a fluent speaker also. What they told us was really interesting. All of them said there's no word in my language for reconciliation, so that's important. And they also said that, to give reconciliation meaning, we need to go back to Indigenous languages and we need to think about what those things would have meant in context, what they mean in the language. So one of the interesting things that the Michif language learner and also the fluent Michif speaker that I spoke to talked about was this idea in Michif about lifting each other up. So there's no word for reconciliation in Michif, technically, but there is a concept around lifting each other up, and it's based on the history of Métis communities and how they organized themselves and how they supported each other in hard times. And there were a lot of those because of neither order of government wanting to take responsibility for the Métis and members of the Métis Nation. So the idea of lifting each other up is really this really rich kind of body of thinking around how we can support each other better and how we can recreate community and how community members look out for one another. And there's a security element too, a safety element, where it's like in our communities, we had ways to address these issues, no Indigenous community, no society of any group of people living together is ever utopian. That doesn't exist historically, and it doesn't exist today. But what people do have, and what all of the language learners and language keepers that we talked to knew, was that there were ways to address that, and there were teachings that went with that, and there were responsibilities that were shared with every generation that made it so that people looked out for each other, people supported each other, and people kept each other safe. And if they didn't, the community also had a way to address that. So there's no word in my language for reconciliation is really a project that speaks to the need to reconfigure how we're looking at this work, reconfigure how we're looking at reconciliation, but I think more broadly how we're looking at justice and how we're looking at implementing these calls. One of the things that I think is really unique about the calls is that they're not just calls directed at governments. These are calls directed at media, at business, at service providers, at all Canadians or all people living in Canada, right? These are calls for everyone. And we really encourage everybody in this to really think about the ways in which you can be change makers. Think about what your scope of influence or what your daily looks like, and think about opportunities in that to be an ally. A good ally in kind of advocating for justice, advocating for the implementation of the calls, and advocating for family members. So before I kind of end, I talked at the beginning about some of the grandmothers that we worked with and some of the family members that we worked with, and I'd like to play you a video. So this is a video that was created along with Lisa Meaches from Eagle Vision, who some of you may know, and that was produced. There were two. There was one with the families and one with the grandmothers. So I'm going to play the grandmother circle video now, which will introduce you to some of the elders that I talked about at the beginning, and also give you a little bit more insight into how how we center this issue of She is Sacred and this idea of She is Sacred in our work.
We are the Grandmother's Circle.
Nous sommes le Cercle des Grands-Mères.
We are the Grandmother's Circle
of Canada's
historic first national inquiry.
We are carriers of traditional knowledge. Our role is to provide teachings and guidance.
We have witnessed the process of the national inquiry and borne witness to the family members and survivors who have testified. We honor the tremendous courage of the Indigenous families and survivors who have shared their difficult stories with us.
As grandmothers and elders from many nations, we have clearly heard from the families, survivors, two-spirited and trans people that the violence must stop.
That the violence must stop.
That the violence must stop.
Nous croyons en la force et en la puissance de nos femmes, de nos filles et de nos personnes bispirituelles et transgenres autochtones.
Since the beginning of European contact, we have experienced the full impact of colonial violence.
This targeting genocide of our women, girls, two-spirited, and trans people is criminal.
Canada must be accountable for its inaction that has led to ongoing violence.
Our ancestors had a beautiful vision of what Canada could be. Nations and peoples living side by side in peace and prosperity.
That vision is still waiting to be realized.
We are the people of the land. We have a responsibility to protect the land as the land protects us.
La terre nous donne la vie, tout comme nos femmes.
We want Canada to know that our women are the heart and home fires of our nations.
For the Inuit, the kulik is that home fire which sustains our land.
Women are the life givers as well as the warriors, fighting to keep our women and children safe.
We are the Red Women Rising. Our Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited and trans people are sacred, valued, loved, and missed. They matter.
Elles sont importantes.
They matter.
Tabuna kiglisinean ni Kanadami tokotao si mayo nuibot iksinaktaw jayam nesukik.
We are all responsible to our children now and for the children still to come.
We challenge all Canadians to read the National Inquiry's final report.
Because we all have a responsibility to act.
C'est un projet pour un Canada nouveau.
This is a vision for a new Canada.
This is a vision for a new Canada.
This is a vision for a new Canada.
So when I started working with the National Inquiry, I thought I knew quite a bit of stuff. And, I have to say quite honestly that I've never learned so much in such short of a time, working with the family members and working with those grandmothers. Their generosity, their kind of hope that the inquiry would actually do something, that the situation will change, and their just confidence in us to carry the stories forward and to continue to do the work was really inspiring and is still very, very inspiring. So in thinking ahead, I think that, one of the things we haven't done is that governments are still not really listening to family members. And this is, again, family members are the people that know. They're the people that had to interact with the police. They're the people that had to, go look for their loved one. They're the people that are out every day. They're the people that are in a camp, by the CMHR, living there, trying to raise attention to this issue. And so no matter kind of what you take away or what your interest is in this issue, I just really encourage you to listen to family members. I'm a person that had the honor to hear from them, to work with them, to learn from them. But they're the experts, and they continue to be the experts. And I think if we want a real chance at confronting this problem, then we need to listen to what needs to be done from their perspective, and then act accordingly. So last thing I'm going to show you is some of the family members that we worked with. I just want to kind of say before I show this video, the family members wanted to have something to talk to the public. They wanted to create this video, and they wrote it and they produced it with Eagle Vision. But one of the things that they really insisted on that always kind of hits me pretty hard is the importance of bringing their loved ones into this space. And so part of the video features some of the family members holding pictures of their loved ones. I want to tell you that just in case that you need to kind of step out or take a moment. This video can be quite triggering, just because it is actually hearing from family members. But if you're able, I really encourage you to stay and to listen to what they have to say. And then after that, we'll kind of close.
Je suis ma grand-mère.
I am my mother.
Je suis ma sœur.
I am my auntie.
Anna Lasta.
I am my daughter.
I
am my wife.
I am my best friend.
We are the families and survivors of missing and murdered Indigenous women,
girls, two-spirited, and trans people.
We are the voices of our lost loved ones who are calling out to be found.
And we echo their cries for justice.
We shed tears.
We shed tears for our sisters.
Nous sommes restés en arrière
to tell their stories.
Pour partager la vérité.
Our ancestors protected our ways
so we could survive and persevere.
Our relationship with Canada was created in peace,
friendship, and trust.
La paix, l'amitié et la confiance.
Promising prosperity,
abundance, and well-being.
La confiance brisée a érodé.
Broken trust has eroded this relationship,
jeopardizing what we hold most sacred.
Our women and girls,
nos femmes et nos filles.
We are here to restore their dignity
and forge a path for change.
Our children are our future.
We must protect them.
Nous devons les protéger.
We ask all Canadians,
to stay with us.
To stand with us.
In ending all forms of violence.
Learn about the truthful,
la vraie histoire
of the relationship between First Nation,
Inuit, and Métis people and Canada.
Honor that truth by upholding their rights.
By upholding their rights
and respecting our sisters.
Et en respectant leurs valeurs.
Our language, our treaties, and our way of life.
With clean water, housing, and safety.
And respecting our women, our children, and our families.
Donner vie à la vérité en devenant des alliés.
By becoming allies and advocating for change needed.
I love you, baby.
Good job. Good job.
Thank you so much.
Taken, not forgotten.
Taken, not forgotten.
I am here to speak for those who cannot speak.
Our women and girls are sacred.
Our women and girls are sacred.
I'm here for justice.
I am a change maker. Are you?
J'initie le changement. Et vous?
I am a change maker. Are you?
So I guess in closing, that always kind of hits me pretty hard. And kind of the idea of everyone being a change maker is in part how we wrote the report, and it's how we listened. Not a lot has happened, and I can be a bit pessimistic about this stuff. But I know that the information's there, and I know that the family members are still there, and they're still working on it. So wherever you do, wherever you live, whatever you do, whatever your position, whether you're faculty or a student or just someone who's interested in the issue, I just encourage everybody to think about how they can be change makers too. We saw it this week. Change is possible. It can happen. But we just all have to do our part. So I'll say Chimigwech, thank you very much for listening, and thank you for the invitation. Thanks. So I don't know I don't know what our timeline is like, Kayla. Like, I think laughing yoga starts soon, right?
We have about 10, 15 minutes.
Okay. Sure. If you have a question, can you just indicate with your hand, because we're recording the session, and so we're going to have a mic just so that the recording can pick up your question or your thoughts. Does anybody want to say anything? Questions? Kind of have to take time sometimes. This soaks in. If not, then I think we can, go ahead.
So thank you so much. I just want Legacy Archive.
Mm-hmm.
Has it found a home?
Well, that is a complicated question. And it remains a complicated issue. So in the last while, thanks for the question. Before the end of the inquiry, we kind of went out to a lot of different kind of educational institutions and museums and said, would you be interested in hosting this collection? We approached like the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. We approached, like the Canadian Museum of History. We approached all these different kind of very big national sort of institutions to say, would you want to take this on? Unfortunately, a lot of people, some people didn't respond at all, which was really rude. But also, a lot of people were really concerned about the capacity because there are so many different pieces in the collection, and some of the pieces have very specific kind of like ceremonial or protocols attached to them. They were concerned about their ability to steward the collection properly. So we talked to the grandmothers, we talked to the families, and we talked to the commissioners, and we said, well, how do we want to do this? And what I heard almost universally from all of those people, especially the family members, was that they were really, really afraid that all of these pieces would end up in the basement of Library and Archives in a dusty box, along with a report. And they said, even if the home that we find for it is not the perfect home for it, let's get it out. Let's get it where it can be used, because really the motivation behind the collection was about kind of education and awareness, right? The whole point of creating it was for that. So they ended up selecting actually the CMHR as a temporary home for it, because CMHR at the time had kind of done a fair bit of work around itself, like had started to do its own homework around some of its limitations and its history, and kind of, I think, wanted an opportunity to work with families and to use it in the way that it was intended to use it. So it's on an MOU right now for 10 years with the museum, who have agreed to show it, to use it, to archive it appropriately and properly, and to make sure that it's going to be accessible for the future. In addition, we had created an online gallery for it, like as the national inquiry, because we were afraid that the government would like bury the artwork essentially. So we have like an online gallery of some of those expressions, but ongoing work to kind of like further archive it properly is happening. And the CMHR is using it for educational purposes. They've had family members in, they've worked with some family members I know who have talked to me about it. It's not a perfect home. There's still very real limitations to their ability to use it in different ways. There's still very real limitations to the, I think, the capacity in the institution to present it. But I think that for the family members that I've spoken to anyways, who had pieces in the collection or who have been involved with the museum, some of them have said that they're happy that it's kind of out in the world, and that the pieces are being used in the way that they were intended. I don't know what happens after 10 years, and honestly, I'm a little bit nervous because, the inquiry is over. None of us are still working for the inquiry because it doesn't exist. But, there's an awful lot of work from the commissioners, former commissioners, from myself, from other members of our staff that still happens to try to keep these things alive. And I don't know what happens, if we're not doing that. So we're going to keep doing it. We're going to encourage the museum to keep showing it, to keep using it, to keep working with the families. But that's where it is for now. So anyways, more to come. Any other questions? Or do folks just need kind of a break before the laughing yoga? Yes, go ahead.
Not a question so much as thank you for that presentation. It was amazing. And also, would you be willing, or are you willing to share that Michif word for lifting people up?
Yeah, I have to look it up because I don't want to butcher it because I don't speak Michif. But I will, and I'll come talk to you and tell you about it right after I'm done talking in this presentation because I want to make sure that I don't get it wrong. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And back to you, Kayla, or is everybody going on a break? What's happening? Back to you.
Thank you so much, Karine. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak and your perspective and your knowledge, and so very appreciate it. And I know I got emotional watching the video too, so thank you for sharing that.